he said, I think, whatever your great grandfather's involvement, I forgive him. And that phrasing, so perfectly put, like at whatever level he was involved, I forgive him, was just an amazing um, gift to me. And so I remember, I don't think you can quite hear it, but I kind of burst into tears in that moment, um, and he hugged me, and it was just so profound. I remember walking away from that feeling like my life had changed forever, like I would never be the same.
You're joining us today as we get to the very core of what we mean by trapped history. Not just the podcasts, the Instagram, the Facebook, but actually our very name. And it comes from something which James Baldwin, the writer and activist, wrote. He said, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." Now, we talked a lot in the show about the first part of that quote, about being trapped in history, the stories that nations tell themselves, that we tell ourselves to feel good about the past, the present, even the future. And there will be a lot of truth and honesty in those national stories, but they can trap us as well, especially when they're applied out of context. I mean, look at Putin's justification for war in Ukraine, that Russia has taken on the Nazis once again. There's a national story, and that is a national story forged in World War II and repurposed for the 21st century. And obviously, you've got to also look at British national stories, like America. We've had a few. There's the Industrial Revolution, the story of empire, story of the Second World War, Blitz spirit, Dunkirk spirit, all of that. As I say, there can be honesty in all of those. There can be a kernel of truth in there too. But more often than not, these histories which trap us can be simplistic and can gloss over the more uncomfortable truths. It can sometimes feel that we're whistling in the dark, trying to keep our spirits up as the world is on the brink.
But there's also the second part of Baldwin's quote about history being trapped in us. And now this isn't the big capital H history of wars and empire, kings and queens. This is the small lowercase history of you and me, of family and memory, of stories passed down through generations. And again, there can be truths and honesty there, but these stories can also sometimes end up like stones you find on the shore, worn and smoothed into a comforting pebble you can hold in your hand and slip into your pocket. In many ways, then, this is an episode for all of us in the studio here, but also for you listening. Because although we're going to be talking about someone else's story, an astonishing story which challenges everything we think about family and our immediate history, in fact, it's a story which all of us are bound to face at some point or another. But whose version of events do we trust?
And so today's story, it's like a hand grenade thrown into a family's history. And to help us navigate a path through this minefield, we are delighted and honoured to be joined by the writer Joe Dunthorne, whose book Children of Radium and BBC history podcast Half-Life received rave reviews last year. Joe, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us on Trapped History. And I'm sorry that we are sitting in a dark, hot basement on the hottest day of the year. But
I forgive you.
Now, Joe, we've had plenty of historians on the show, but also some people who've almost just stumbled into history writing, Satnam Sanghera, for instance. And Joe, you too, you're not a historian, you're a poet, you're a novelist. So how did Children of Radium come about?
Well, it's interesting. In my family, there are lots of historians. Both my parents are historians, and I had very much planned to never become a historian on the basis of that. So yeah, I was quite resistant to, and realistically quite nervous of writing about history. I think quite reasonably, my parents said to me when I was starting this book, "Are you sure you're ready for this? Are you capable of doing this? This story is going to take in the major events of the 20th century. You know, it's the scale of it is enormous, and you haven't studied that. Like, should you really take it on? And I think that was a reasonable question, and a question I was asking myself: am I uh, up to the task? And also, it's an extremely serious history. It's, you know, it's the Holocaust. It's there's another genocide in it. It's a real. It's not one to kind of tread on lightly. So I did ask myself those questions, and I approached it with trepidation. And what I also wanted to include in the book is the dispute in my family. Like when my mum steps in and is like, "No, you've got that wrong," or "I don't believe you," or "I think, you know, I read an event in a different way." I wanted to be able to include differences of opinion within the text to really get closer to what I think of a family story as being, which is a shared living story that we discuss with each other and disagree about, and somewhere in between all our opinions is the family story. Whether it's true or not, we don't know, but it's very much this thing that lives between us. And I wanted to try and write a book that allowed a little bit of room. I mean, it's still my story, but a little bit of room for that multiplicity.
And I assume, and do correct me if I'm wrong here, but when you're writing a novel, and when you're writing fiction, you're in control of the story and you decide where it's going. But when you're researching and writing history and family history too, you're not in charge, and the characters are real, they're not fictional, and they might do things that might feel quite unsatisfactory from a writer's perspective. Like you might not get the satisfying ending you want, or the fiery speech, or the comeuppance, and sometimes you won't even get the story. And I think you say that great swathes of your great grandfather's memoir were maybe a bit boring.
Right.
So how does that work for you as a writer, that you're not moulding the story?
Well, it's interesting because it's both a relief and a problem. Like, you know, I writing novels is really challenging for that thing that you're summoning it all. It's all on you. You know, you go into your room with all your made up characters and you make up some more things, and that can feel very oppressive sometimes. So there was a part of me that absolutely loved the knowledge that all I had to do to bring this story into life was research hard enough, read deep enough, look into enough holes in the family past, and I could at least summon the history. And it felt like that. I mean, I've written it somewhat like a detective story, at least from the perspective of me as the kind of narrator, because it did feel like that. You know, doing the archive work, making discoveries, and eventually the story comes to you, which is very different to writing a novel. So I actually find it really exhilarating.
This all starts with the quote unquote family story and the romance of the family story. I mean, your family story, Joe, there's something exotic and something romantic about it. In the 1920s, your great grandfather, Siegfried Merzbacher, a brilliant German Jewish chemist, developed Doramad, a radioactive toothpaste. I mean, just to repeat that, it is a radioactive toothpaste. You too can have gleaming white teeth before everything falls out.
I have to be so careful with this because I feel confident it's the only document of its kind in the world. It's a handwritten recipe for radioactive toothpaste from 1925.
Wow.
How radioactive is that piece of paper?
Yes.
Well, I haven't measured it. To be honest, it could be. You can see Siegfried's handwriting. I'm not going to open it up because it might crack. But
can you bring it a bit nearer the camera?
I can. I'll just try and open it up a little bit.
Wow.
It's got the ingredients and the grams, and it shows that one of them is radioactive calcium carbonate, 0.016 grams. And it's from 1925. So my grandmother was 1 year old when that was written, and she started using radioactive toothpaste as soon as she had teeth.
And how long did her teeth last?
She had dentures by the time I met her, as did, it depends, a lot of people, but yeah. So that was one of those documents, and that was a funny one because that document was in the so-called family archive, which is just a chest of drawers in my granny's bedroom, and I don't think anyone paid attention to what that was. Like, it was just, it's this little piece of paper. It says in German Doromad recipe. And it was only after a while I was like, when I'd been getting into the book, Doromad recipe, I was like, oh my God, we've got this document.
Wow.
Interestingly, I got an email the other day from a radioactive scientist. I'm not sure what the correct phrasing is. Who says who's told me that they have collected now enough samples of Dorma, because there still are some tubes knocking around if you're into those websites.
On eBay.
Yeah, you can get them probably on eBay. I mean, I think they're pretty rare,
Man.
but there's a few. Obviously, the radioactivity has changed. I mean, talking about the children of radium, you know, the radioactivity changes over time. But he said he's going to do a kind of full analysis of the toothpaste to try and work out exactly how radioactive it is and how much it was.
Wow.
I have to say, I feel a little bit giddy after you brought that out. I feel, oh, my hair falling out.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, in a lead-lined box.
I'll
I'll put it away
in your lead-lined envelope.
in my lead-lined envelope.
The story we're about to hear starts with the unearthed memoirs of your great-grandfather, the chemist Siegfried. But even then, the story we're about to hear doesn't really feature in those thousands of pages of tightly typed German text. It's almost an aside. Oh, by the way, this also happened. Instead, this is the story which you, Joe, have pieced together. And just so we're all on the same page, the bottom line is this. Siegfried and his wife and children, a Jewish family, did escape a fate which would likely have ended up in the death camps. And he did that while also producing chemical weapons for the Nazis and developing the gas masks that ultimately made the death camps possible. Joe, I feel my stomach turn when I read out those words, as I absorb the implications about a Jewish man being involved in all this.
Mm-hmm.
How did you feel when you found that out?
Well, you know, I think we've probably all felt the temperature drop in the room a little as you said that, and I still feel so. You know, I've talked about this quite a lot now, but it's still hard to talk about and painful to talk about. It didn't. The information never came to me in one go. I mean, what's interesting is about his memoir and when he makes a confession about his work with chemical weapons, is that he's still really quite evasive about the extent of the work, the type of work, how long he was doing the work. So I remember reading it at Christmas. I was reading it in English at this point. I was sitting there, you know, 200 pages about his great aunt, 200 pages about going to school in Munich, and you're thinking, you know, this is a man who lived through 1930s Germany with a Jewish family. Like, where is that story? And you're kind of going on and on and on. And then the book gets, in the German, it's page 1680. So we're talking quite a way into the text. And he reaches a page and he says, I now come to the darkest part of my professional life. I wish to make a confession to my descendants who will read these lines. I made a grave error. I betrayed my most sacred principles. And paraphrasing, but the weight is still on my shoulders to this day. And that moment, that confession, I mean, explicitly a confession, is about his decision to work with chemical weapons in 1928. And so I can, as I was reading this in my Christmas with my family all around, I remember looking up and I'd kind of looking around at my family and being like, does anyone else know about this? Like, how is this not part of our family story? It's interesting because it's not a secret in the sense that some people didn't know. It's just a secret that because people don't tell each other. So it's, you know, that the difference between not knowing and maybe not even, I wouldn't even say necessarily my family are withholding it, like deliberately. It's just that it never comes up. I mean, that sounds like an evasion in itself. Obviously, that is a form of secrecy. So I learned the reality of him working with chemical weapons right into the 1930s, late 1930s, not just in Germany but elsewhere, over time. So it never really, I mean, it landed, you know, the weight of it landed on me regularly, but it was in in pieces as I got deeper and deeper. And there were these moments. I remember being in the British Library. Um, it's relatively small detail, but in his memoir he says, "I never wrote for this." Am I jumping ahead? Is that okay?
No.
I never wrote for the company magazine, like the big chemical manufacturing company he worked for, who became a very important Nazi war manufacturing company. I never wrote for their company magazine. I mean, that magazine, I've seen the copies, it becomes very Nazi, quite quickly. And that seemed an important thing for him to acknowledge in his memoir, and it felt an important thing for me to read, as though there were some lines he was drawing, ethical lines. And so I'm in the British Library, and I'm just reading through. Like, British Library has all the copies of this magazine, because of course they do. And I find an article by my great grandfather, and that's in 1932. I think, okay, 1932, that's quite early, it's before the Nazis. And then I find another, and that's in 1935, and it was co-written with a man who was a member of the Nazi Party. And so I just remember, like, putting down the magazine and just walking the corridors of the British Library, just feeling overwhelmed, really overwhelmed by it. And so there were lots of moments like that where you're having to recast, erase parts of your understanding of your family past and move it somewhere less comfortable. And that happened again and again and again.
Okay. And obviously today, if some of the stuff that we're asking you and saying feels too on the nose, just tell us to back off.
Thank you. I genuinely appreciate that, because it is a lot to talk about.
It's the 1920s, and everyone is radioactive crazy. We find Siegfried working for the Auergesellschaft, Auer for short. Their radioactive street lights, the Auer lift, burn cleaner and longer than other lamps because they're soaked in thorium. And this is where Siegfried makes his famous toothpaste. So famous, in fact, that in 1928 his boss, one Karl Quasebart, asked Siegfried to head up a new laboratory, a secret one funded by the German military, tasked with developing and producing chemical weapons. Now, this is before Hitler and the Nazis come to power, but in losing the First World War, Germany's military was severely constrained. No air force, no submarines, no tanks, and specifically no chemical weapons. While the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned the use of chemical weapons, it said nothing about their manufacture. But Germany was explicitly singled out. Not only could they not be used, but they couldn't be made there. But knowing the risks, Siegfried accepts the job. Why do you think he did, Joe?
Well, I've had lots of time to think about that question. According to his own memoir, he takes the job for the reasons that it paid a lot more. He got extra, what he called danger money, because he was going to work with chemical weapons. It was a risky job, and so he got extra salary. It was also, within his career, it was a promotion, like a significant promotion. It's kind of slightly hard to understand in that context, but he was saying, in the world that I was working in, I was going to be the director of my own laboratory. That was a big deal. He was going to get to design all the laboratory equipment and have people working under him. Also, which is, it chimed with me as I was writing it, my two young children were the same age that Siegfried's two young children were when he made the decision. He was talking about, having to look after his family, feeling like he needed the security of this job. And also he talks about the fact that it's peacetime and it's 1928 and it's, the Weimar Republic's doing quite well. And there's a sense that maybe it's a stable world, and all that he convinces himself, and I think this is slightly delusional, he convinces himself, all we're doing really is preparing in case of the possibility that we need later to produce chemical weapons, as though it's just a kind of preparatory thing, getting ready in case of the worst, which is true, but also, as I see it, there's no positive outcome for making chemical weapons. I mean, it's only got one use, right? It's very clear where chemical weapons are going to end up. But those are the things he tells himself, and I believe him in the sense that I think those are the reasons he said yes, and I can empathize with it as well as
I
questioning it.
suppose there's something sort of some sort of similarity with people working in the nuclear field after the Second World War. You know that by building up nuclear weapons, you are, you know, we're in the world of mutually assured destruction, so you're building them up so that they aren't used. And so perhaps he's also feeling that we're building stocks of chemical weapons to show that we cannot go to war, because then the results would just be too horrific.
Right, which actually turns out to be true in the case of the battlefield. You know, there was both the Germans and the Allies had huge chemical weapons, war gas stores, chlorine gas, phosgene gas, all these other gases, which they decided not to use. I mean, those poison gases weren't used at all in battle, and that partly was a sense of, if one of us starts, who knows how far it will go. But you know, we know from the nuclear experiment that it's a kind of, you know, Manhattan Project and all that. You tell yourself these things because you need to find a rationale. Maybe you don't, but in this case, you do find a rationale for doing this work, and of course, it ends in, you know, it doesn't always end well. Um, so yeah, I feel like there's a bit of mental gymnastics going on in finding a rationale for doing things that you probably know you shouldn't.
Siegfried sets to work at Auer's new state-of-the-art lab in the town of Oranienburg, just north of Berlin. Now, this is a special town, a secret military town, which later, under the Nazis, was known as SS Town. During the war, which, let's not forget, was after Siegfried's time there. Alongside the chemical weapons lab, there is an aircraft factory, the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, the SS headquarters, which would run all of Germany's concentration camps, even a uranium facility for the failed Nazi nuclear program. Remember, Siegfried starts working there in 1928, before the war, before the Nazis come to power. But he is most definitely producing chemical weapons there, 3 in particular. Diphenyl arsine chloride, which makes you tear off your gas mask and vomit, diphosgene, which drowns you in phlegm, and mustard gas, known in Germany as Lust, which burns your lungs and your skin. Now, Siegfried isn't just making this stuff, his role is to improve it, and that's what he does when he creates super Lust by adding arsenic to the compound. I said all of this is before the Nazis, but it is only a matter of time. In 1933, Hitler's in charge, and Jews begin to be written out of Germany's national story.
Siegfried is Jewish. He is illegally developing chemical weapons for an army which is quickly becoming Nazified. And he continues to do it for 2 years under Hitler, all the way up to 1935, when he and his family leave Germany for Turkey. Joe, it seems pretty clear, I think that's probably an understatement, that there are a number of things here which we need to unpack. And the biggest one is, are you okay? How are you feeling?
You mean it right now? Or?
Yes, right now, and about all of this story.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier on, this is probably a good thing. It doesn't get, you know, I've talked about it a lot, and it's still emotional to talk about and challenging to talk about. I guess I wouldn't want to reach the point when I was completely immune to that. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. It's been part of my life now for a few years, and I think it's becoming more integrated. I think part of the problem was the shock of it. You know, the sense of this handbrake turn in your understanding of yourself, and I think that's the same for all, you know, my family members as well. It's taken a while to integrate into our understanding of ourselves.
And I was about to ask you, in fact, in terms of how the family have dealt with this in the decades before you started kind of delving into it. Because as you say, you know, you couldn't call any of it a family secret. It was all there in black and white in this massive document that you've described. So how is all that dealt with, and how is it processed, and what does a family, his children, his grandchildren, kind of, what do you do with that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it is this doubleness. You know, on the one hand, he's written this document, and he says, I confess to my descendants, like it's for us explicitly. And yet the story he tells is evasive, it doesn't go far enough. He's trying to tell us and also hide something. So it's really interesting. It's both a confession and an attempt to shape the past. In terms of my family, as I mentioned, my parents are historians. My mum, she's a German speaking, she grew up a bit in Germany. She can read German, so almost all the documents were in German, and she's a proper historian. So I called on her. This was a lot of this was during COVID, so she had some time in her hands, and she was amazing. Like I would send big tranches of letters to her, and she'd help me translate them. And I think her support was really important because it's her grandfather, the person I'm writing about, Siegfried, and she's really the surviving person who knew him the best. She was his eldest granddaughter. And she loved him. He was this sweet, cuddly, warm grandpa, a little bit eccentric, and they had a strong relationship. So to get, I guess, clearance from my mum to investigate and dig into the story and complicate the family story, even though it would made her uncomfortable, and she would have her own. If she was here now, she would have her own opinions on everything. I tried to include some of that in the book. I really felt freed by the knowledge that I had her on my side as I went through it all, because it was, I guess I did feel guilty about messing with a family story that was perfectly fine. Everyone was pretty happy with, that account. So it felt a bit. What did it feel? It felt, I guess, yeah, a little shameful to be seeking out the lies. Can't you just let it be? Obviously, and in a way, I think if I'd known at the beginning of all this the reality of my family story, maybe I wouldn't have told it. It was because it came in increments. Like there was never one big reveal. So I would always be like, oh, that wasn't true. I better check that. I better check that. I better check that. And this chain of investigation eventually leads to having a fuller picture. But because it happened in that small way, bit by bit, it was almost like the boiling frog metaphor, the slow sense of it. And then suddenly I realized, oh, actually, I'm really in much deeper than I could have imagined.
Mm.
And the writer in you as well, because as you say, it sounds rather wonderful of your mother giving you clearance.
Right.
I think that's a really important part of the story.
Mm.
And also the writer in you, because you could have done all of this research and it could have been an interesting discussion at the family dinner table, but it isn't that. It is a book and a podcast and
Yes.
all of that.
Yeah, and that's an interesting contradiction, isn't it? Yeah, you're I am a writer, and there's always this doubleness. And most writers have this. What's the phrase? I think it's Philip Roth. Nothing bad can happen to a writer. The principle that anything bad that does happen to you, oh goody, I've got this thing, I'm going to put it into my fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an element of that that's going on with me digging into this. There's a moment, my mum, she managed to get a hold of my great grandfather's medical records, which was an amazing feat. And I remember getting them, and they were very shocking in lots of ways. But of course, a part of me was ecstatic. I was so thrilled by this chance to see inside my great grandfather's mind in a way that I hadn't got to before. So yeah, there's always a doubleness of like, I guess, shock about the reality of the family story and a little bit of glee because I'm trying to tell an interesting story.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Siegfried's work in Germany, it seems like the story, a Jewish man making chemical weapons for the Nazis. But perhaps the real story isn't a German one, it's a Turkish one, and that's where we're heading to next. Siegfried's memoirs end as he heads for Turkey. But it's not as simple as they escaped, dear reader, because Turkey, while it's still neutral until the dying days of the war, has close and significant ties to Nazi Germany. And Siegfried is not a free man, and he hasn't even actually fled Nazi Germany. No, Siegfried and his family are sent to Turkey by hour to work with the Turkish government under the guise of the Turkish Red Crescent, which is equivalent to the Red Cross. Our covers all of his relocation costs and pays half his wages for a couple more years as Siegfried becomes co-director of a new gas mask factory in Turkey's capital, Ankara. Now, the Red Crescent, gas masks, this all sounds quite above board and quite worthy even. But Joe, what was Siegfried actually doing in Ankara?
Yes, so yeah, it does sound above board, and I think that was very much like the Turkish Red Crescent thing was very much what we had in our minds as a family about that period. It felt like this, what a relief that he'd escaped to this other more humanitarian work. What is revealed in the letters from that time is that he is still working with chemical weapons. He's testing the Turkish army's gas masks with the latest chemical weapons to see their resistance to them. So he's still, he kind of claims in his memoir, "Oh, I never touched chemical weapons again. What a relief that was." Well, that's just not true. But more significantly, the Turkish government in 1937 put in an order for chemical weapons from Germany. And we'll get to why they do that. But there's a letter from my great-grandfather to his old boss in Germany, so from Ankara to Germany, trying to help arrange and facilitate this purchase. And he says to his old boss, there's going to be people coming from the Ankara government to speak to you, and they want to. He's slightly euphemistic. I forget the phrase. It's essentially he wants to buy some of the products that I used to work with. And it's only become recently clear as other documents from the Turkish side have started to be revealed. And it gives you a sense of how slow some of these histories move in terms of discovering the documents. It's only in recent decades that they found this out, that, yeah, Ataturk and his second in command, the president at the time, cleared purchase from Germany of various chemical weapons. And so the documentation is still thin, but there was this pipeline between Germany and Turkey, military technologies going both ways. And yeah, the chemical weapons that were bought by the Turkish government were then used in the east of Turkey.
And it is, as you say, it's the summer of 37. And the Turkish government, they don't just buy it's 20 tons of chemical weapons that they buy from Germany. And as you said, a few months before that, this rather euphemistic letter from Siegfried, who was sort of the conduit for the sale. He sort of set people up to do this.
Right.
And this is what he wrote in the letter, that his Turkish colleagues wanted, I'll just say this, to order large quantities of the chemicals the department that used to be under my leadership works with.
Mm-hmm.
There's another bit of sort of other euphemisms. I think there was a letter he wrote where he says, and I quote, "Of course, for a long time now, it's not only gas masks that are being manufactured."
That's right.
So again, there's this feeling that something is happening.
Mm.
I mean, my entry point to this is someone who I was seriously considering featuring on Trapped History on our Instagram account. A woman called Sabia Gökçen.
Yeah.
The world's first female fighter pilot. I came across her a few years ago, and it sounded like, wow, this is an amazing story. When she was 12 years old, she was adopted by Turkey's founding father, Kemal Ataturk. And in the mid-1930s, he encouraged her to pursue aviation, which she takes like a duck to water. She flies fighters, bombers, trains other women to fly. She's a true pioneer. I mean, this sounded like one of these great inspirational stories. But here's the problem. Sabia becomes the world's first female combat pilot, because she takes part in what is known in Turkey as the Dersim Massacre. This was when, over a period of 18 months in 1937 and 1938, the Turkish military brutally suppressed a rebellion in the Kurdish mountainous eastern region of Dersim. Thousands were killed. Estimates vary from the official tally of around 15,000 to over 70,000. They were shot, they were burnt alive, drowned, bombed. And that's where Sabia comes into the story, as she reminisced in the 1950s. They gave us the order, shoot every living thing you see. We were firebombing even the goats, which were the food of the rebels. And ultimately, the quantities of chemicals which Siegfried was helping his colleagues in Ankara to buy from Germany were then used in 1938 to gas people sheltering in caves in Dersim's Lash Valley. Hundreds were killed. There were no survivors, and Sabia was again one of the pilots. I can't help but notice at the same time you've got German planes dive bombing civilians in the Spanish Civil War. And taken together, this does all seem like a Nazi proof of concept of how to kill large numbers of people quickly and, horrifyingly to say it, efficiently. So, I mean, Joe, I thought the story here was Jewish guy makes chemical weapons in Nazi Germany, but the story seems to be more this about the Dersim massacre and Siegfried's perhaps less than arm's length involvement in it.
Yeah, and it speaks. I mean, the whole story speaks. You mentioning the Spanish Civil War, the interconnectedness of things, and what was interesting to me about researching this was how it's not. It reveals that these histories are not just little pockets of isolated, story, that everyone is moving around and the governments are in communication, and the scientists are going here and there, and it's a lot more messy than I think I certainly understood it to be. But what's challenging about one of the things that's challenging about researching the Dersim massacre or Dersim genocide is that by necessity, the history of that is largely oral history. Like in Turkey, that massacre is unacknowledged until very, very recently, and even then it was only partially acknowledged. It wouldn't be part of a Turkish education to learn about that. And so the story of what happened there in 37, 38 exists in stories told by survivors, who are not that many, and it's carried by individuals. And so researching it and pinning it down in a really concrete way is very challenging, which obviously suits people who don't want to remember it. And so the events of the Lash Valley, where it's believed the gas brought from Germany was used, it's still a matter of, well, actually, it's amazing. It's a matter of listening to recordings done by a few really brave individuals in Turkey who took the time. One man in particular called Kemal Tash, who went round way before it was on other people's minds, going from house to house with older people in the Kurdish community of Dersim, and getting their stories on tape. And he really was a one-man archive, like way before anyone else was thinking this needs to be recorded. He would go from place to place, and he really carried that. And he's got hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews, which are now completely like foundational for recording that history, because it's not in documents, or at least not in released documents, and it's not in history books. I mean, that's changing a little bit now. But yeah, it's amazing speaking to Jamal, because he talks about the weight of that. He said something which really broke my heart. He said, my children miss the person I was before I started doing this work. And you could tell he missed his old self as well. He had changed. It changed him to have to carry this past and this history around. And that's the value of having histories enter the public realm and be official and have memorials. There's no memorial for the Dersim massacre. There's none there's no one in Germany. There's none in Turkey. Not a thing. And that becomes, the burden is then on the individuals who have to remember it, or the descendants of the individuals. So it's passed down this like heaviness, and that's the purpose of memorializing, is to take the weight away from the individuals and make it part of a public understanding. And I really felt that speaking to him, extraordinary self-sacrifice to take this history forward himself when he could have just turned away and not thought about it.
When I was listening to your podcast Half-Life, and we heard about your visit to Turkey and the sites of the massacre, and you were really open with the people that you were planning to meet there about your family history, and
Right.
you said you wished in a way that someone would have told you not to come. Can you elaborate on how you were feeling at that time?
So that was this sense of, I'm arriving in this part of Turkey, the eastern mountainous region. Maybe people, I'm bringing my own family history and this really, dark connection to the weapons that were used in the genocide. And I don't want to feel that I'm forcing people to relive a trauma they would rather talk about. And so I was trying, me and my producer were trying to be very delicate about making sure that we navigated that, and the people we spoke to really wanted to speak to us, rather than kind of barreling into a room and being like, can you just like relive a thing you don't want to talk about? But what I was met with was enormous generosity and welcome and encouragement and gratitude and kindness and openness and all these, and warmth and hospitality of just like immense kindness, which in a way I felt I didn't deserve and maybe feel uncomfortable. Strange thing to say, I guess, yeah, it felt so, I was so awestruck by that generosity, and yeah, I felt ashamed. I wanted maybe someone to acknowledge that shame, and but that's not what happened. I think the reality is that from their experience, like the people from Dersim, this story doesn't get told. It doesn't get told by the BBC, and it certainly doesn't get told by the Turkish government or like mainstream media in Turkey. And so there was a sense that that's why they were happy to talk to me and happy and like kind to me, is because they recognized that it was a chance to have that story reach a wider audience.
The moment when Ali gives you a hug and says he forgives Siegfried, and you hear the rustle of your clothes, and I was like, oh, that moment, it was a lot, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was such a profound moment. Yeah, he said, I think, whatever your great grandfather's involvement, I forgive him. And that phrasing, so perfectly put, like at whatever level he was involved, I forgive him, was just an amazing gift to me. And so I remember, I don't think you can quite hear it, but I kind of burst into tears in that moment, and he hugged me, and it was just so profound. I remember walking away from that feeling like my life had changed forever, like I would never be the same.
So Half-Life was originally produced by Falling Tree Productions for BBC Radio 4's The History podcast. And we have some audio taken from the podcast now. It's an interpreter explaining to you what happened in Dersim as you looked upon it.
Toplayıp 3-5 gün yürütüp dağların arkasından getirip burada hani o infazları gerçekleştiriyorlarmış mesela.
He says that most probably this place had like a military base nearby, and the soldiers would gather all the people from different villages. They would come here, and rebels or not, it's not important. Everyone was killed because you cannot. From the state perspective, you cannot differentiate between the rebels and non-rebels. Whomever lives here is rebel from their perspective, of course. But of course, this includes 5-year-old kids or even unborn kids and women and the elderly. They just forcefully walked them until here, to this point, and they massacred them all. And Metin says it was not just for once, several days, several times, and that's why most people say the river was flowing blood. It was not water; it was just blood. In every rock, every mountaintop, every part, every corner of this river, there is such stories.
We didn't go up to the cave. I think I'm not sure I would have been able to cope with that. But we went to the entrance to the valley where the cave was. It was a really profound experience. Speaking to people who had been to the cave, locals, Metin, who was guiding us there, and Jamal Tash, who'd also been there and seen the bones of the victims still in that cave. Yeah, my memories of that time are being very overwhelmed, and not only because of the story and the history and the pain of that, also because of the essentially surveillance state that the people of Dersim still live in the east of Turkey. It's an area full of checkpoints because the Turkish government is extremely suspicious of, in the same way they were in 1937, they still regard the Alevi Kurds as, rebels, if you want to put it like it was put by the translator. And so while we're there looking into the valley and thinking about this incredibly painful history, which is obviously connected closely to my family, military, like, what would you call them? Armored vehicles are coming down the road beside us, and one of them stopped to kind of interrogate us. So you get this doubleness of, like, you're trying to think about and hold in your mind this history, which is at the same time, and not figuratively, it's literally being repressed and stopped by the Turkish government and a surveillance state. So it was a strange doubleness of hearing these stories and trying to really register the weight and the horror of them, and also understanding that in that moment we were not supposed to be talking about them, not supposed to be thinking about it. So it was a really overwhelming experience.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm.
It seems one of the things that I am continually surprised at. I'm continually surprised doing this show is that history isn't something which is confined to the past, that history is alive and with us now. And it sounds that you experienced that. You were experiencing history living around you at that moment, and what had happened nearly 100 years ago was still being played out today.
Which is exactly what the people from the Dersim region say. They say the genocide never stopped. What started in 1937 is essentially still being played out today in the way that Kurdish Alevi people in the region are treated by the government now. So it very much, they see it as directly connected, as running on from that period.
After the war, Siegfried moves to America, then Britain, where he dies, aged 88 in 1971. But in that time, particularly in the USA, he'd written that memoir, The Story Without a Story. And it's this, the memoir, which I think is at the heart of the family history we've been slowly unwrapping. Because it's there, but it's also not there. I can almost hear you screaming at the pages as you read it, Joe. Tell me what happened. Why aren't you telling me? And I think that's the thing which is really interesting about your book, Children of Radium, Joe, because in a way, it's a memoir of a memoir. It unpicks Siegfried's story and it asks the big questions about this thing called memoir. what is it actually for? Specifically, what is Siegfried's memoir actually for? And what's its purpose?
It's interesting, when I was doing my research, I came across this historical term called, they call some documents ego memoirs. And it strikes me, yes,
Is it every memoir an ego memoir?
and then you realize essentially, yeah, every memoir is an ego memoir, and it's probably one of the least trustworthy types of document. But when I was coming to it, when this all started, I trusted it implicitly. At least I trusted it as a good faith attempt to represent the truth. Um, and now I really do think of it as an ego memoir, and I'm sure that my memoir of the memoir is also an ego memoir, in that I'm telling it in my way. At least I would argue that I own that subjectivity, and what I try and build into the book is a clear sense of my own perspective warping events around me, as all our perspectives do. But yeah, in terms of his memoir, yeah, it was just a slow realization. Well, there's one argument that the memoir at 2,000 pages is really a pathological response, i.e., that he had a breakdown. He was retiring after this long career in science and in chemistry, and he needed to keep busy. Like, if you want to think about it, I mean, it's all speculation, but as I see it, he'd been through all these things. He'd done a lot of things he was ashamed of. He'd been through, separate to that, a very numerous traumatic things in his life. Obviously, being driven out of his homeland, become stateless, his family at risk, all these things. There's a sense that you retire, suddenly all your life and your past is coming to you. You're reflecting on yourself and what it's all about. And he has this near suicidal breakdown, and then it ends up in a psychiatric hospital, and they essentially say, which we've got the medical notes, the doctors essentially say, I don't think this person can be treated through therapy. More or less, he should just stay busy. Like, that's like pretty much the bottom line. You could take some pills, they give him some medicine, and he does stay busy. Like, from that, he comes out of hospital, and until his death. In fact, at his funeral, which I found, it's not in the book because it came separately, I finally found the one of the speeches, but that was given at his funeral, where the person said, the last time I saw him, he said, "Oh, I've still got to finish my memoir." So even the 2,000 pages wasn't complete. Like, it was an ultimately an endless project because it needed to be. Like, he just was typing, as I see it, as a way to not think about, not to dwell on himself, and just to be in his mind. Be like, okay, what can I do instead? I'm just going to type. So there's a sense that those years of just tapping away as a way to not think about other things.
There's an interesting thing here about who memoir is for. But it sounds from what you're saying that Siegfried's memoir, even though it theoretically has a public airing, if you're writing something down, it is with the expectation that someone's going to read it. But actually, the main audience is himself.
Yeah, or even it has no audience, which I guess is what I think of it as, pathological. If it's just a symptom side effect of an anxiety, then the contradiction is that he does say explicitly, I'm writing this for my descendants who will read these lines. So that there is that sense of him being specifically thinking of his descendants to tell them about their family history. But I also think it was really about himself and needing to just keep his mind on other things.
And it's, he's not going around telling anyone who wants to hear about his time at Auer.
No, he's telling no one.
He's telling no one. And even, as you say, when he has, sounds as if he has quite a lifetime experience, post-war lifetime experience of therapy and counselling. But it's highly likely that he never told anyone about chemical weapons. I think you found There's a time in 1957 where he's hospitalized for 10 days, and that's in an American psychiatric unit. And over there, there are daily sessions, multiple psychiatrists taking notes, and you've been able to see these notes. And there isn't one mention of chemical weapons. They're writing about his marriage, his childhood, his work, all of these things, and that is closed off. So, in private, theoretically safe space, he doesn't go there. But he then starts writing a memoir where theoretically he would eventually get round to going.
It's so interesting. I mean, I don't know what that's about. Reading his medical notes, his Freudian analysis from 1957, pages and pages of it. What struck me was how different I'd read the memoir, that was like the ego memoir, and then you were getting these kind of behind the scenes documents of these medical notes, the analysis, and it was a very different, much more anxious, much less happy portrait that came out. But what struck me is, yes, he doesn't mention his work in chemical weapons, and in fact he's slightly evasive. I forget the phrase he uses. I think the therapist just says, he had a successful career as a scientist or something. But what it struck me reading those notes is that, it comes back to your trapped histories as this the theme. At the personal level, the things that were consuming him were not the grand narratives of history. He was concerned about his marriage. He was worried that his wife had been unfaithful. He was worried about feeling like his body was failing him because he was getting older. He was feeling like he was useless now. His son was suddenly really successful as a scientist, and he felt like he'd been overshadowed by his son. And these are all very human, to me, very human things that do not relate to the great sweeps of history and are always at play. You kind of think, someone living through all this stuff must constantly be playing out the Holocaust or something in their head. But actually, we're also getting a sense of the reality of like a moment to moment life, and it kind of cut against the book I was writing. I've been writing this story that takes in the whole 20th century and all this stuff, and everything has to be about his past in 1930s Germany. But this was a little corrective to that. Like, you can still day to day not be thinking about those things and have a billion other things on your mind which are making you anxious. And maybe the chemical weapons work is in there, probably it is somewhere, but it's maybe not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. At the end of his life, I'm sure he had many other things he was thinking about.
The aches and pains,
right,
are the things which will be in your head the whole time. No, I mean, a memoir is one person's story, one person's take on their story. But I'm struck how Siegfried's story doesn't just begin and end with him, with his memoir. It resonates and it echoes down the generations. It doesn't just get tidied away in a few hundred or a few thousand pages of closely typed text. I've written my story. It's my truth, my confession, whatever my truth is. But family doesn't work like that, and history doesn't work like that. You actually refer to Siegfried's memoirs as, I quote, the foundational text of your family history. It's the tablets of stones. It's where you go to for the story. So I just wanted to come back to family. And I'm immediately reminded of people who say, maybe in a slightly different context, well, it happened so long ago, why beat yourself up about it? But it feels equally applicable to this story, to Siegfried's story, to your story, Joe, that you can't just tidy this away.
Well, the two things one thing that I really felt like I'd learned from writing the book, which we talked a little bit about, is that the history is not in the past. It's completely ongoing. And even though lots of the events are close to 100 years ago now, like there's this town of Oranienburg where the World War II bombs to this day are still exploding, or in Dersim where to this day, they're still trying to get the truth out about the events of 1937-38. So it just isn't the case that it's in the past. It is like very literally and in real life connected. It's not like, oh, some metaphorical thing, the past lives on. No, the bombs are still under the ground. The history, the documents about the genocide in Turkey are still to be uncovered. So the thing I really felt coming to this book was, oh my God, it's not a story. It's not some distant story. It's connected to us and lives inside us in a very real way. And that was shocking, because I think I felt coming to it, I'm going to tell this kind of walled off period, interesting period in history, and I'm just going to tell it, and it's going to be sealed. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that it was very much an ongoing and live project.
And again, this story isn't just about Siegfried. There are a number of family members involved here, aren't there? And a good starting point is the title of the book, Children of Radium. And I don't think that's referring to Siegfried. I don't think he's the child of Radium. So who is, Joe?
Well, the Children of Radium, the title, which I feel like I don't get asked about enough. So radium, as it no, we need a proper scientist here, but as it decays over time, is said to have daughters. So radium has daughters. It changes. It's becomes radium-228 becomes radium something else. Then it becomes uranium. Then it becomes, I don't know, thorium. And this is over sometimes tens of years, sometimes thousands of years. But I really like the idea of an element having daughters, and it made me think, I guess, about, in metaphorical terms, about the passage of a family story across time and it changing shape and changing properties and powers as it gets passed from generation to generation. Like the story in my family was not really spoken about, was very hard to speak about for the people who lived through it. Siegfried obviously wrote his memoir, but he wouldn't have spoken about it. And his sisters more or less said nothing about it. He had two sisters. And then it comes down a generation to my granny, and she is spiky about it in a different way. And then it comes to my mum, and she's open about it, but she wouldn't actually tell it, or she wouldn't investigate it herself, I think. And it comes to me, and I'm at a distance from the story. Like, I didn't know any of the people firsthand. I never met my great-grandfather, but I'm really interested. And so you get this strange mutation of relations to the family story, and I thought that was an interesting metaphor for the way radioactive elements change over time. And obviously, the radioactivity, at times I kept finding myself using this metaphor. Like, I feel like certain parts of the story are radioactive, and that sounds like a glib statement, but it did. I remember in writing the book, there were parts of the story that were so dark and so difficult to contend with, that and structurally I felt like, where can I put this in the story? It's almost too painful to put here. I can't put it at the beginning. God, people would be terrified if I put it there. I can't put it at the end, because that would just be too much to end on. And there was certain parts of the story that I did feel that they were, they were glowing with this sense of threat and pain.
Joe, there's one moment in 2021 which really resonated with me, when you're invited to Berlin State Parliament to speak about your grandmother's life, not Siegfried's life, his daughter's life. And you see this as the opportunity you've been waiting for to speak about Siegfried, to perhaps unburden yourself about the complexity of his story, of your family's story, and the discomfort of it all. Can you tell us a bit about what happened, please, Joe, when you were preparing that speech?
Yes, so it was a speech that was to open an exhibition in Berlin at the big synagogue in Berlin, to celebrate and tell the stories of some Jewish lives before before the Nazi period, and what happened to them during the Nazis, including my grandmother's story. But in the middle of being invited to do that, I just discovered all the things that I knew about my great-grandfather and his work, and how messy and complicated that all was. Of course, in the little blurb about my grandmother in this exhibition, none of that is mentioned. And I was thinking about they invited me to give the speech, and I was thinking about, oh, it's going to be in the Berlin Parliament, and the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, are going to be there, the right-wing, the resurgent right-wing party in Germany. And so I was thinking about all these things, and I was thinking, I really I kind of have a responsibility to be truthful and try and complicate this family history, which is told in not untrue, but fairly like simplistic terms in this exhibition. And and I felt I should really try and say something to try and give a sense of how complex history is. We can't think of history in these binary terms. It's not helpful to think of it like this. Humans are just more complicated than that. But I'm writing my speech. I'm rewriting my speech. I'm trying to find the language. How am I actually going to say this in the Berlin Parliament? And I ended up doing a Siegfried in that I thought, you know what, that's not what they want. What they want is me to tell strictly my grandmother's story. I'm going to stick to her life. I'd be messing with the brief if I brought in all this mess. I'll just keep quiet about that. And so I end up giving a speech which just follows the beats of the story as known by my family. Again, thinking a little bit of the AfD, listening and not feeling comfortable telling the story of a Jewish man leading a much more messy life than is maybe the expected story, and terrified that somehow they were going to take that and use it as a way to persecute Jewish people in modern day Germany. I mean, this is the sort of anxieties that are going through my head. And so I end up editing. I don't lie, but I just don't say the certain elements of my story that I would be uncomfortable saying. And it's interesting, looking at in the book, I guess I draw the connection between Siegfried's own editorial decisions and my editorial decisions. It's just, oh, I'm not lying, I'm just not mentioning this thing. And how easy and how commonplace those decisions are.
You're bruisingly honest about it, and I found that incredibly refreshing and moving. I think the phrase you said is you felt a kindred form of cowardice with Siegfried, and I can totally understand that. And how we try to find ways to explain our actions.
And you can probably tell by the way I'm speaking about it, you refine and you practice the stories we tell about ourselves. Oh, this is why I did it. Here's my reasons. I'm trying to justify it to you, justify it to myself. And so you practice them and you inwardly get the story until it sounds convincing, and then that becomes the truth.
Suppose this brings us sort of full circle right back to trapped history, the history which is trapped in us. Stories we want to tell, but those aren't necessarily the stories which we do find ourselves compelled to tell anyway. And in that section about your speech in Berlin, you write a lot about ambiguity, how you wrestle and hopefully come to terms with that. I mean, have you, when all's said and done, have you come to terms with the complexity and the ambiguity of Siegfried's story?
I think my feeling ultimately is I don't really want to come to terms with it. I don't want to have it settled within me. Like I think we were talking earlier on, you were saying, you can be okay to talk about this. I don't really want to reach a point when the feeling has been evacuated from the story and it's just a story. I want to keep that liveness, keep the complexity of it, because as I said earlier on, I think it's a living history. It's not something to be kind of tidied away and feel completion about. So I've come to terms with what I've discovered, but I'm willing to believe the story could move in other directions. I could discover other things. So I don't think of it as finished in that sense. And, that's been played out since the book came out and the podcast came out from other little stories coming to me from other family members or people getting in touch with other parts of the history. The history is spread, and it's not. It really doesn't feel complete.
So how do you feel about your great-grandfather now?
I spent a lot of time with him now. 5 years writing the book and thinking about and trying to work out who he is and what person he was. I think ultimately I feel empathetic towards him. I feel like I understand him. I feel like I can understand the decisions, even the bad decisions. I don't believe that I feel like I would have drawn the line at chemical weapons. For me, that does seem, as I said earlier on, there really is no outcome for that other than what they get used for. So I do struggle with that one decision. Like you have to know what your chemical weapons are ultimately going to be used for. But I do feel empathetic for him. I understand the pressures that were on him. The pressure to, he did help his family survive Nazi Germany. They got out. They had a good life in Turkey. My granny ended up marrying a Scotsman and got a passport and came to the UK. Like he did his job, service to his family in that sense. And maybe it was selfish. Almost certainly it was. But there's an argument that he made the decisions that were necessary to help his family survive. So yeah, I feel empathetic about him.
And in Half-Life, your podcast, you read part of the speech which was made at a Dersim memorial unveiling in 2025. It was written by the academic Professor Akjam. He said, "An unspoken trauma is like a lump caught in the throat. It suffocates relationships. If you cannot speak about your past, you cannot build your future." And this is obviously about the people of Dersim. But I wondered, Joe, do you feel somehow lighter or more free for having let this story out into the world?
By the way, I just love that speech. I think it's the most amazing and profound speech. No, I don't feel lighter. I feel heavier. I feel more complicated. No, it's the answer. I don't, but that's okay. I'm happy with that.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you so
I
much.
mean, absolutely, it has been hard and difficult, but
Yeah,
I think it has been incredibly important for us and hopefully for our listeners as well. So thank you.
I hope so. It was really nice to be here, and thanks for the great questions and thoughtful analysis.
You've been listening to Trapped History, written and presented by Oswin Baker and Carla O'Shaughnessy. Our engineer has been MK Lee, and the Trapped History theme is by Pavlo Bujarin. If you've enjoyed this episode of Trapped History, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to stuff. And you can subscribe to our newsletter at trappedhistory.com, where you will also find the Trapped History archive, exclusive subscriber content, and of course, our Hall of Fame. Thanks for listening. See you soon.